So it's 1779, it's spring in London town, and a young Dutch doctor, Jan Ingenhouse, leaving London. He's travelling from London up to Yorkshire to spend some time in the countryside and write his new book about smallpox. So he's in the Yorkshire countryside and he's really enjoying the spring bloom, the British spring bloom. But he can't quite work out how the plants are growing. And he sat there and he's sort of thinking about and contemplating how are these plants growing. Now, a few years before that, he'd spoken to his mate Joseph Priestley, who had basically said, "Look, I've discovered a gas that plants are giving off, but I don't really know much else about it." So Ingenhouse gets a jar, he puts some plants in it, he fills it up with water, and then he waits. Nothing happens first day. Tries it again, second day, still nothing happens. And then the third day, he sees something. He starts seeing these little bubbles forming on the plants. Difference is that particular plant had been left in a small path of daylight coming through an open window. So, like any good scientist, he got loads of different plants, repeat the experiment again, and kept getting bubbles being formed in daylight. Okay, so we're going to take an in-depth look at this absolutely classic practical, particularly using Elodea, how we can get the practical to work really, really well, really reliable, repeatable results, and how we could actually keep it in the lab or source it from other places. Okay, first things first, not every aquatic plant is going to work. There are only a handful of plants that are truly aquatic, plants that actually live, spend their whole life underwater. Most of the plants that you buy in a fish shop are actually plants that live above water, but they're grown underwater, and they live on sides of rivers, they live on river banks, they live on rocks around the river or around the pond or around the lake, or their roots are in the water, the roots are in the soil in the water, and what the plant is doing is actually pushing, it's growing to break the water's surface and to get to unlimited carbon dioxide and oxygen in the air, rather than dissolved oxygen and carbon dioxide in the water. So the plants you're actually looking for are the ones that are completely aquatic. So we're talking about Elodea, we're talking about hornwort, we're talking about kabomba. Those plants are specially adapted to living in the water. That adaptation is what we take advantage of when we're performing this experiment. So these plants don't have a traditional vascular bundle like terrestrial plants. They have a specialised stem and a specialised tissue that runs through the middle of it. And that tissue is called an parenchyma, and it's going to send oxygen down from the leaves, through the stem, down to the roots of the plant that are in the soil. And that delivery of oxygen is going to keep the roots aerated. It's going to keep the soil aerated around it, and it's going to keep beneficial bacteria alive, as well as having air in the plant, which is going to keep it afloat. It's going to keep it close to the top of the water and closer to the light. And that is what we're seeing when we're conducting this experiment. We're seeing bubbles of oxygen that would normally be sent down to the roots via the stem. So some of these fully aquatic plants have got narrower parenchymas. So hornwort's parenchyma is very narrow. The stem itself is very fragile. And when you look at the parenchyma under a microscope, the air spaces, the diameter of the tubes that the air is delivered down to is very small compared to Elodea, which is a lot wider, and the stems are a lot stronger. Okay, let's talk about plants and species. The two main types of Elodea that you're going to get in the UK is either going to be Elodea densa or Elodea canadensis. This is Elodea densa, native to South America. It's also known as Brazilian pondweed. It's got a broad leaf and the leaves are kind of transparent. It's the main species you're going to find in your local fish shop or your local aquarium shop, and is an excellent choice for microscopy. Okay, let's talk about keeping it. Don't forget this one's a tropical species, so you're probably going to want it in some sort of fish tank. In terms of getting hold of a tank, the easiest thing to do is get one second hand. Get something big, go on Facebook Marketplace, go on eBay, anywhere where you can buy something second hand. Tanks do not hold their value very well. People are always buying tanks and selling them. You can find a really big tank with a light for next to nothing on Facebook Marketplace. So keep your eyes peeled and look for a good one. You want to make sure that it's definitely not got a leak. You can always ask someone to fill it up in front of you. Some people do get a lot of luck with just taking some Elodea, throwing it in a tank and it growing like crazy. That might just be down to the fact that you've got good nutrients in your tap water and the right level of nitrates and trace metals. I've heard a lot of people say, I've just got a load of Elodea, throwed it in a tank and it's grown. That works for some people, doesn't work for everyone. These particular species of plants grow by absorbing nitrogen mainly through the water column, so dissolved nitrogen that's in the water column, unlike other plants that will absorb nutrients through the soil and not necessarily always through the water column. A really well-established tank would be the best bet. I'm going to have to do another video, I think, on tanks in schools. But really, you want to be cautious of the nitrogen cycle. You want to be thinking about, especially if you're keeping fish, you want to be thinking about ammonia, nitrite and nitrate, and how that equates to feeding the plants and getting them to grow. Should also be thinking about dissolved oxygen and dissolved CO2. You can pump extra CO2 using CO2 injection kit. But you could also, especially if you're not keeping any fish and you're just keeping the plants, you could actually pump CO2 in by making a yeast sugar CO2 generator. And I've done that before with my algae and it totally worked. The other thing you want to be thinking about is potentially, if you're not keeping fish and you're not thinking about the nitrogen cycle, then some sort of fertilizer. It's quite common for people to add or dose aquarium fertilizers like this one, where you add a pump daily for a week, and then after a week you'd water change all of the concentrated fertilizer out and start again in a new week. And it is essentially just NKP and metal salts. You can make your own fertilizer using chem-store chemicals, potassium nitrate, phosphates, and then some small amounts of trace metal salts. Some fish keeping hobbyists do make their own fertilizer from scratch, and you can find that recipe online just looking at aquarium hobby websites, and they'll have a full list of ingredients and weights. The last thing you want to think about is lighting. So for the tank method, you're going to be looking for lights that are specifically dedicated for growing aquarium plants. You can find really premium ones. Fluval, Kessel do really, really good lights. Anything that just says planted aquarium, that's what you want to go for. That's going to have the right wavelength of light for growing plants. Pretty much that'll be all your limiting factors. So that'll be light, CO2 and nutrient availability. You definitely want it on a timer. You don't have to worry about it that way. And the photo period will be really consistent. You can find decent lights in an aquarium shop or on eBay or Amazon. Definitely go LED, but again, look for secondhand. Realistically, you're trying to emulate the sun, so you want really decent lights. Just as a caveat, if you are going to go for this method, you might want to add some slow growing plants like this Anubias, and make sure you add lots of Elodea to begin with. What you're basically doing is cooking up the perfect storm for algae growth. So being able to adjust the nutrients, the CO2 and the light cycle will be really useful to curb the algae and have it outcompeted by the Elodea and some slow growing plants. I mean, if I'm being totally honest, I don't really believe that this is a very viable or sustainable way of keeping Elodea for class use. Honestly, I feel like it's not really possible to grow as much Elodea as you need just in a tank. Potentially, if you were to add the fertilisers and the CO2, you might be able to. We do the Elodea experiment with 2 year groups. And there's 10 classes in each year group. So I could be doing it up to 20 times. I've always got a tank on the go at school, and it is useful for buying Elodea and putting it in a tank, storing it in a tank, leaving it in a tank until it's ready for use. I think if you were in a small school or you were only using it a few times a year, this method would be really sustainable, but for us, it's just not sustainable for the amount we need. Okay, let's look at Elodea canadensis. This is the North American species, and it's the cold water species. It is the species you are most likely to find in any pond, waterway, lake, and that is because it is incredibly invasive. It's so invasive, it is now illegal to buy and sell any Elodea canadensis because of its aggressive growing and how it chokes out waterways and grows so quickly and so rapidly. It stops native plants from being able to grow because of how good it is at absorbing nitrates. It is a submersed macrophyte, so it lives in the water column. Unlike the other plants that try and break the surface, it will just stay in the water column and absorb CO2 and oxygen that's dissolved in the water. So it will try and fill any space of the water column and float to the top to get as much light as it can. Now granted, this is the niche that all of these plants that we're going to look at do fill. I feel like Elodea canadensis is probably the best at it, perhaps too good at it. You can collect it and grow it in a tank indoors, as long as it goes back into the tank when you're finished with it, or again, it's just disposed of properly. Somewhere where it's not going to go back into a waterway. It's illegal to start growing it outside, so you can't take a cutting or a piece of it and put it into your pond. But it is not illegal to collect it. If anything, it's encouraged to collect it. Just make sure you don't put it back when you're finished with it. Make sure you throw it away, make sure it goes on a compost heap. I reckon that you are probably never more than 1 or 2 miles away from a source of Elodea. I've seen it in almost every back garden pond that I've ever visited. I've seen it in lakes. I've seen it in a pond in a zoo. I've seen it in waterways. Okay, so this is hornwort. This is going to be a UK native kind of version of Elodea, if you like. It's sort of going to fill the same niche as that submerged macrophyte that's going to be in the water column and doesn't break the surface. It's rapidly going to absorb nitrogen from the water column. The other really good thing about it is it's not as strictly regulated as Elodea. It's very easy to find. It's very easy to collect. And if you wanted to cultivate it, you could just grab something from a pond and kind of stick it in a bucket outside or in your own pond and just let it grow in the sunlight. There are a couple of downsides to using hornwort over Elodea. So one major one is that the stems are quite weak. It means that plant, when you move it from one environment to another, from one tank to another, or from outside to inside, in an attempt to grow it and cultivate it, you're going to find that you're going to get a lot more melting. And melting is what they call in the aquarium hobby. When you move a plant from one environment to another, you see a lot of leaves dying back. And with that, you'll also see some new shoots growing. Those new shoots are a little bit more adapted to the new climate or the new environment. And so it's just really important to bear that in mind when you're moving these plants, when you're buying these plants. The first couple of weeks, the first few days, they're going to be dying back. It's not until you start seeing green new shoots that you're really going to start seeing some growth. But with that, you'll find that its parenchyma is a lot weaker and a lot narrower. So when you're looking at a cross-section, you can physically see the airspace is smaller. And also where that stem is a little bit weaker, it's going to be a little bit more prone to airlocks. It's going to be a little bit more prone to having issues when you're cutting it. It's going to be a little bit more prone to having much smaller bubbles, and they might even come out at a much faster rate. Sometimes they come out so quickly that the students can't even count them, even with a clicker. They're going to need to be recut. And so this is a little experiment where I tried to prepare 20 tubes pre-cut in the prep room and had it all bubbling before the students arrived. I had to move all the tubes from the prep room to the classroom and set this whole thing back up again. I don't think it would be very viable during a busy term. And I feel like it took a lot away from the students, where all they ended up doing was just coming to the front, getting a tube and putting it in front of a lamp. Again, you can find this pond, waterways, fish tanks, mate's pond, eBay, Amazon, fish shop, to name a few. And the last thing is that it's not as good for microscopy as Elodea is. It doesn't have that classic plant cell straight out of a textbook, classic brick shape that you're looking for, and it's not as easy to mount due to the shape of its leaves. So just one honourable mention is going to be Kabomba. Kabomba is really hard to get a hold of. It is a very finicky plant to keep. It does need very particular conditions, and it is very soft and weak, and so it suffers really badly from melt. And realistically, you're going to need a kind of high-tech setup, which is kind of pumped CO2. It's going to be dosing nutrients, highlights, and fancy setups. I don't think it's very economical to keep it in a school for this practical. So that is just a couple of options for Elodea and for hornwort. Some ideas on how to grow it, where to get it from, and now we can start talking about making the practical work.